We shall commence this module by discussing about public borrowings. Public borrowings or debt refers to the government borrowings raised through internal and external sources. During past few decades, the concept of public debt as a tool of fiscal policy has assumed greater significance. Keynes saw it as an instrument of reviving a depressed economy. The government borrows either to meet its budgetary obligations or to stimulate the economy. The former implies that the government had little cushion in its cash flow and falling tax revenue makes it necessary to borrow. Government borrowings to stimulate the economy can shorten the period of economic downturn and boost the business confidence. The global economic crisis of 2008 and 9 witnessed such government activity where majority of nations had to resort to excessive government borrowings to stimulate their economies. The US budget deficit increased from $318 billion in 2005 to $1,300 billion in 2011. Japan, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Singapore and the US are the most indebted nations of the world. As per recent estimate, India is running a budget deficit of 3.9% of its GDP. This debt has to be serviced and excessive amount of it pose serious problems for an already indebted economy. In case of external debt, payment of interest and principal leads to the transfer of real output to other nations. The implication of debt on an economy depends upon the utilization of funds raised through borrowings. In case it is used for productive purposes such as capital formation, it could contribute to the real income of the present and future generation and add to repayment capacity of the government as well. However, if borrowings are used to finance only current expenditure, then it poses the risk of rising debt to unsustainable levels. The following paragraphs discuss the implication of public debt on price levels, private investment and growth. Then we shall move on to discuss the principles of debt management and repayment. After studying this module, you shall be able to learn the implications of public borrowing on price levels, learn the concept of crowding out of private investment and activity, learn the principles of debt management and repayment. Let us now discuss the public borrowing and price level. The Keynesian school of thought advocated an active role of the government in the economic activities. During the Great Depression of 1930, the government assumed an important role in reviving of the depressed economy. The roots of the government role in economic decision making are found in the Keynes consumption theory, according to which an individual does not consume the entire increase in his income, rather saves a part of it. Since all output is not consumed, unemployment may persist in an economy. Thus, a depressed economy facing falling aggregate demand and deflation faces the risk of falling into the problem of prolonged underemployment and depression. When aggregate demand is low, an investment push by the government can help to boost confidence in the economy. An increase in investment will lead to a rise in aggregate demand and price level. As price rises, business profits will increase and profit expectations will cause businesses to increase the output. Thus, employment, output and income will increase through the multiplier process. Here, government expenditure financed through debt will be instrumental to curb the deflationary tendencies in the economy. A liquidity trap is a situation where low or zero level of interest rate fails to stimulate the economy. In this case, a fiscal policy, say through incurring a public deficit, will have a full multiplier effect on the income, output and employment levels. However, excessive public debt pose real dangers for an economy. It means that substantial resources are required for servicing of debt. It creates vulnerabilities which transmit into macroeconomic shocks, transmits the burden to future generations in the form of high taxes. The relationship between public debt and inflation was first examined by Sargent and Wallace in 1981 of the Minnesota School. In their article, Some Unpleasant Monetarist Arithmetic, an attempt has been made to analyze the link between fiscal and monetary policy. Debt finance through increased liquidity plays a significant role in raising the price level. It is argued that a shift to debt financing from tax financing will result in inflationary tendencies in the economy. They present a model where it is assumed that the monetary base is closely connected to the price level and that the central bank can raise the seigniorage through the creation of money. They show that exogeneity of the process for the government's deficit reduces the central bank's ability to control inflation. Large deficits and increasing government debt may force the central bank to issue money to ensure solvency, ultimately resulting in higher inflation. Woodford in 1996 argues that in the presence of sluggish price adjustment, the fiscal shock disturbs real output, real interest rate and causes rise in the level of prices. Evidences suggest that fiscal instability necessarily results in price level instability in the sense that there exists no possible monetary policy that results in an equilibrium with stable prices. Fiscal shocks do change households' intertemporal budget constraints at what would otherwise have been equilibrium prices and interest rates, hence markets fail to clear at those prices. The effectiveness of this mechanism depends on the nature of the fiscal expansion, transfers to households or increase in public expenditure, the public debt GDP ratio and on the speed of the fiscal adjustment. In addition, economies with high public debt GDP ratios and slow fiscal adjustment experience larger price fluctuations. Evidence from emerging markets with high public debt levels point out that median inflation more than doubles as debt rises from the low range of 0 to 30% to above 90%. Another view held is that government has an incentive to decrease the real value of its outstanding stock of interest bearing, nominally denominated debt through an unanticipated burst of inflation. This could lead to higher inflationary expectations and associated rise in the nominal rate of interest and higher inflation risk premium. Debt purchasers add their inflation expectations and interest rate premiums into the prices they are willing to offer. They do so to compensate for the possibility that inflation may exceed their expectations. Debt purchasers in high debt countries may then raise their inflation risk premium even before the onset of higher inflation. The more debt issued, the greater the risk of unanticipated inflation burst and thus the greater the risk premium. Unanticipated high inflation is then a compelling method for lessening a country's debt trouble. Moreover, this will be accompanied with further increase in the interest rates. A balance of payment deficit on current account can help a nation to avoid such dangers. However, this would mean an external imbalance and a withdrawal of external finance, which could further result in inflation. So, when the government runs an excessive budget deficit, the choice is between inflation and a payment deficit. Moving on to discuss the crowding out of private investment and activity. There has been substantial analysis in the academic literature in the crowding out aspect of debt-financed fiscal policy. The link between the fiscal deficit and growth, saving and investment and debt and interest rates have also been examined throughout the economic history. It has assumed greater significance in the recent past when public debt has surpassed the nation's threshold limit in many cases. The advocates of fiscal policy as an instrument of economic revival suggest that an economy with unemployed resources can stimulate economic activity through government investment in productive capacity and thereby can increase the real private investment also. This is explained with the help of the diagram. The Keynesians have emphasized the expansionary effect of debt financing of government expenditure. The increase in government expenditure through borrowed money causes an upward shift of the aggregate demand or IS curve schedule. An economy with less than full employed resources will witness a corresponding increase in the output and income. With an increase in income, tax revenues will rise and ultimately a balanced budget can be achieved. In case of an economy with less than full employment, with an expansionary fiscal policy through public borrowings, IS curve will shift to the right and thus real income and output will rise along with the rise in the rate of interest. However, there is another aspect of the government spending. This is related to an economy with full employment of resources and a fixed supply of goods and services. In this case, the government can claim more of the economy's output only by depriving the private sector of its use. The crowding out of real private expenditure and private investment caused by the price inflation and rise of interest rates is a well-recognized concept. The transactions crowding out associated with the budget deficit financed through sales of interest-bearing bonds have been a standard part of the fiscal and monetary policy analysis through the ISLM model. When government borrows funds to finance its deficit, there will be an increase in demand for loanable funds. Given the fixed supply of money, there must be an offsetting reduction in demand for money for markets to clear. If the demand for money balances is sensitive to the rate of interest, the required offset for demand for money is brought about by an increase in the interest rate. However, since the investment responds negatively to the rise in interest rates, there will be decline in the private investment. We know interest rate is inversely related to the investment. So, investment schedule is downward sloping. And so, with the increase in interest rate, investment will fall, causing a movement along the demand curve from I1 to I2. Thus, debt financed government expenditure crowds out the private investment. Thus, due to crowding out of the private investment, the net effect of debt financed expansionary fiscal policy will be negligible. As pointed out earlier, the impact of public borrowing will depend on how the funds are utilized. If the debt is used to fund consumption, then the investment will be crowded and burden will be placed on future generation. They would inherit a small stock of capital, an economy with a smaller capacity to produce, hence a smaller real output. The expenditure includes transfer payments to individuals, administrative expenses, etc. Private investment is affected under the following conditions. As discussed earlier, an economy with full employment and with an unchanged monetary policy will witness crowding out effect when the government resort to deficit financing, causing interest rates to rise and corresponding reduction in investment. Secondly, the presence of existing debt will also affect investment. Government spending used to finance consumption expenditure will lead to a rise in consumption. Moreover, bondholders may consider bond holding as a part of their wealth. If the wealth effect of bond holding is taken into account, then it will exert influence on economic behavior. When more bonds are issued and sold by the government, wealth of individuals will increase, causing a rise in the demand for money. With fixed money supply, an increase in money demand will cause a leftward shift of the LM curve from LM0 to LM1. Thus, expansionary fiscal policy causes IS curve to shift rightward to IS1 and real income rises to Y star. However, wealth effect causing leftward shift of LM curve causes the interest rate to rise and crowds out the private investment. Moreover, higher tax imposed by government to raise funds for the debt servicing will also exert some negative influence on investment. Finally, the existence of large debt may also cause loss of confidence on the part of businesses regarding the health of the economy. They may curtail their investment. In case aggregate supply is assumed to be fixed, an increase in the aggregate demand caused due to the expansionary fiscal policy financed through debt financing will lead to a rise in the price level with real income and output remaining unchanged. At unchanged level of income, tax revenues will fall, exerting pressure on the government. Eventually, budget deficit will persist and go on accumulating towards unsustainable levels. If, however, the deficit spending is used for improving productive capacity, then the future generation will have additional productive capital to increase the real output. In this case, both consumption and investment will rise, and the positive effect of the government spending may more than offset the crowding out effect. In case of debt raising through external sources, heavy government borrowings inflict substantial harm to the economy even if the interest rates are steady and private investment is unaffected. In this case, foreign saving is imported to offset the government dissaving to sustain the domestic private investment. This implies transfer of resources and output earned from domestic production to service foreign debt, leaving less domestic income available. Hence, external debt is also not cost free. Next, we shall discuss the principle of debt management and repayment. As discussed, over the period of time, public debt has assumed greater significance in economic policy formulation of any nation. Public debt brings with it resources required for planning economic success. However, it is not without cost. As we already know, public debt poses an enormous burden on an economy. Hence, the management of public debt occupies an important position in the decision-making process of economists, policymakers, politicians, etc. J. M. Buchanan defines public debt management as such is defined to include that set of operations which must be performed by the Treasury Department in maintaining a national debt. That is to say, debt management takes place even when no debt is being created and no old debt is being retired in net terms. In simpler terms, public debt management refers to the determination of objectives of public debt by the fiscal and monetary authorities, the size and composition of debt, the terms of the debt, the maturity pattern and interest rates, redemption of debt, etc. Public debt holds profound importance for social, economic and political health of an economy. Lal, 1978, identifies the objective of debt management as the efficient functioning of the public debt management machinery, warrants that public borrowing programs should be so conducted that securities should be so issued that the maturity mix from non-marketable to marketable, from long-term to very short-term securities should be so determined, the interest rates on the securities should be so fixed, the refunding, conversion and monetization of the debt should be so managed, and finally for meeting the interest burden as well as the repayment of the principal without jeopardizing the development process in the underdeveloped countries. Objectives of debt management. The first objective is to repay loans at the earliest. It means funding of as much debt as possible. The second objective is to secure loans at the low cost, that is minimization of the interest cost of the public debt. The third objective of public debt management is to meet the needs and interest of various classes of investors. The fourth objective is to ensure economic stability, mobilize savings and promote economic growth and an effective coordination between the economic activities of government and of the central bank. Principles of debt management. Following are the broad principles for management of public debt. Low interest cost on servicing debt. The objective of debt management is to secure a debt at low cost and interest on debt servicing should be minimum. Debt servicing forces the government to raise taxes, posing an additional burden on present and future generation. With ever-growing needs and increasing government activities, it is not easy to secure huge amount of debt at low cost. Moreover, this objective is in conflict with the objective of price stability. Maintenance of low market interest rate may lead to inflationary pressures due to the rise in aggregate demand. The effective debt management requires reconciliation of such conflicting objectives. Meeting the needs of investors. An effective debt management policy should aim at fulfilling the needs of various classes of investors. The structured term of debt, liability schedule, etc. should satisfy the largest number of population. A balance must be maintained between various methods of debt repayment. Debt servicing through additional money can lead to inflation, whereas through additional taxes can lead to deflation. Coordination between monetary fiscal policies and public debt policy. The three policies play a very significant role in ensuring the proper health of the economy. Hence, the three must work in unison to ensure the economic stability and economic growth. Funding of short-term and long-term debt. The funding of short-term and long-term debt requires an increase in the rate of interest, but a rise in interest rate will negatively impact the investment behavior and can cause an economic downturn. Thus, funding operations must be carefully undertaken in order to ensure economic stability. Repayment of public debt. It is to the advantage of any economy to pay off the public debt as soon as possible, as it poses a serious burden on the present and future generation. Timely redemption saves resources for private investment, preserves the investor confidence, reduces cost of debt management, saves the government from bankruptcy, and thus ensure economic well-being. Following are the important methods of debt repayment. First is refunding. Refunding of debt implies the issue of new bonds and securities by the government in order to replace the maturing bonds. Hereby, the government through issue of new bonds gives option to the existing bond holders to subscribe to new debt by surrendering the old. Thus, money burden of debt is not relinquished and is accumulated owing to the postponement of debt repayment. The next is conversion. Under this method, existing loans are converted before maturity into new loans at an advantage in servicing charges. That is, to move from high interest debt to low interest debt. Converting old loans into new at lower rate of interest reduces the debt servicing burden. Apart from reducing cost, conversion reduces the burden of interest on the taxpayers. The success of the conversion will depend on various factors such as efficiency in public debt management, creditworthiness of the government, and maintenance of adequate stocks of securities, etc. However, one must note that conversion is no substitute for repayment, as it does not relax the debt burden. A reduction in interest rate reduces bondholders' ability to pay taxes, which may cause falling public revenues, thereby reducing the government capacity to redeem loans. The next is surplus budgets. Any excess of public revenue over the expenditure can be utilized to pay off public debts. However, given the ever increasing public expenditure, surplus budget is a rare phenomenon. Moreover, the imposition of higher taxes or reduction in public expenditure for achieving a surplus budget can have dire consequences for the economy. The next is sinking fund. The government creates a sinking fund for the purpose of debt repayment. The government sets aside a part of current public revenue every year in such a way that it would be sufficient to pay off the funded debt at the time of maturity. It is the best method of debt repayment, as the burden of public debt is least felt, as the tax burden is spread evenly over the period of accumulation of the fund. The next is terminable annuity. The government issues terminable annuities to the bondholders that mature annually. Hereby, public debt is cleared off in annual installments and debt burden is gradually reduced. The next is additional taxation. It is perhaps the simplest method of debt repayment. Hereby, by imposing new taxes, the government generates additional revenues to pay off debt and interest. The method is critical on the grounds that it leads to the transfer of resources from taxpayers to the bondholders. It may also impose a burden on the future generation if new taxes are levied to repay the long-term debts. Given the above linkages between fiscal, monetary and public debt policies, efficacy of public debt management is an important factor in the overall health of the economy. For countries where public debt has reached enormous levels, the government must try to achieve a reconciliation of conflicting objectives apart from early and easy redemption of their public debt, which already pose greater risk for the economies, as recently in the case of Greece economy's fallout. Let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. Elevated and rising levels of public debt can impact growth through various channels, viz. Inflation or deflation, higher interest rates and reduced private investment, reduced returns on investment due to uncertainty about future prospects and policies, and higher taxes. High public debt can cause high inflation. It is argued that a shift to debt financing from tax financing will result in inflationary tendencies in the economy. Public debt financed through deficit financing can cause crowding out of the private investment through a rise in the rate of interest. Public debt management refers to the determination of objectives of public debt by the fiscal and monetary authorities, the size and composition of debt, the terms of the debt, the maturity pattern and the interest rates, redemption of debt, etc. Refunding, conversion, surplus budget, sinking funds, terminable annuities, additional taxation, capacity levy and surplus balance of payments are various forms of public debt repayment.